Hello everyone, my name is Tom, and today we're going to be talking about being a man. A big topic in the headlines these days is around the idea of toxic masculinity. Just the phrase itself has become so divisive for people for various reasons, and many, whether they agree with the fight against it or they think it's another way that social justice is attempting to fuel cancel culture, many don't seem to grasp what toxic masculinity is actually referring to. I, however, had to write a research paper on toxic masculinity when I was in college, way before this was a discussion in the mainstream. I read several academic studies from professors on what toxic masculinity is, how it works, and the negative effects on both men and women. But the thing is, even though someone like me finds social science fascinating, I love knowing how people interact and what all of that means, most people are gonna think it's kind of boring and probably even stupid. But just because you personally do not care about something doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you. The way you experience the world around you, or how you affect the culture of that world. Which is why these things appear in the art that we consume, to show us in context why these things matter and how we can do better. As this becomes more of a mainstream discussion, it's important to understand why it's relevant to people, or even why it's relevant to you. And of course, I may be arguing my own position in this topic, but my main goal here is, even if you, the viewer, disagree with my stance, I want you to be capable of doing so respectfully and understanding the topic enough to make that decision for yourself. So without further ado, welcome to the Runaway Club. As many of you know, I absolutely love the Avatar franchise. I even love Korra, flaws and all. But I have said at every opportunity that The Last Airbender is a masterpiece and possibly one of the greatest stories ever told. Part of the reason I believe that is because within a fairly short series, there were so many real-life ideas covered in such a way that was understandable even for children. As I discussed in my last video on the show, The Last Airbender covers a lot to do with inner peace and non-violence, following a main character who was raised in a culture that would rather focus on de-escalation than conflict, that cherished life and love over conquest and inner peace over power. Like most stories, the antagonist acts as an opposition to this ideology. The Fire Nation had risen into a global superpower in the 100 years that the Avatar went missing, and as a result, the culture of its people changed for the worse. For brief background, the way that the culture of the Fire Nation changed saw it move away from the spiritual side of the firebending practice. Firebending's value as a culture beyond being used as a weapon was lost, all while the cultural identity of the nation was erased in favor of radical nationalism, which was all thanks to Fire Lord Sozin, who through propaganda and rewriting history, changed the social practices, standards, and beliefs of his country. The new norms would reflect a pro-war, aggressive, power-seeking mentality, which was all part of Sozin's plan to make the Fire Nation the largest superpower in the world. But I want to talk about what this means from the perspective of individuals. We see time and time again in depictions of the Fire Nation and their culture that brutality and strength are the standard, while kindness and restraint are synonymous with weakness. This idea is extremely toxic, and the reason why this all ties into toxic masculinity. A member of the Fire Nation, especially if they are a firebender, is expected to never show weakness, to seek power and demonstrate that they are powerful. So as a result, certain behaviors that go against these ideas of power, behaviors like empathy, sadness, or even homosexuality, are atrocities. In my last video about Avatar, I talked about identity versus morality, and even touched heavily on the identity of what it means to be a firebender, how it negatively impacts firebenders, and how at times it even holds them back from being true masters of the art. In a way, this video builds off of that one, because the struggle between identity and morality has a lot to do with how toxic masculinity manifests within many of us. A common misconception about Wait, I don't really need to be doing this like spooky layer stuff anymore. Alright, now you can see me. A common misconception about toxic masculinity is that it implies that being a male or being masculine is intrinsically toxic. However, the idea of toxic masculinity is not that being a man is toxic or that being masculine is toxic. Toxic masculinity refers specifically to ideas programmed into all of us throughout our lives surrounding how we see manhood and what men should strive to be, how men are supposed to treat others, how we're supposed to carry ourselves and express our emotions, as well as how we're not supposed to act. We're not supposed to be vulnerable, show sadness, in some cases we can't even show happiness, because these are things that might make us seem weak, which is never allowed if you are a man, because weakness contradicts what we are supposed to think about manhood, or at least that's what Papa Man tells us. And the fact that I brought up Soza and criminalizing same-sex relationships in the Fire Nation may seem unrelated to this whole discussion, but it's actually relevant. Because in our society, there aren't many things more socially emasculating for a man than being a homosexual, which is part of the reason why toxic masculinity is actually very common among gay male communities. Just by being gay, your identity as a man is brought into question. So gay men will not always, but often, feel the need to resort to hypermasculine, unhealthy behaviors in order to compensate. And straight men will go above and beyond to avoid being perceived as gay because it could detract from their sense of masculinity. Which is dumb, because what could be manlier than two dudes just ferociously
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
But to bring it back to Avatar, most of these social expectations and views of the Fire Nation are very similar to the ones that men in our reality are raised to see as true. I know growing up watching Avatar, I thought there was some justification to the fact that the Fire Nation did treat certain characters as poorly and cruelly as they did. I thought Azula was justified in calling Iroh weak for not wanting to conquer Ba Sing Se once he knew the loss of his child. I thought Ozai was justified in burning his son for refusing to fight his own father. I thought there was some level of truth to the shame the nation had for Iroh and Zuko, because if they were truly strong, then they wouldn't have had mercy, restraint, or given up. But what these thought patterns really said about me was that I had a toxic view of strength. And strength is a key trait in what society expects from men. So it transfers over to the real world into having a toxic view on what it means to be a man. Which ideas like this are what come together to create toxic masculinity. But some men feel that even the proposition that some of the ideas that we learn to associate with masculinity are ones that we should abandon is an attack on what it means to be a man. To tell men that we should be less angry, less violent, less stubborn, and more sensitive and kind may seem like an agenda to dilute or even feminize men into being docile, what do the kids call them? Oh yeah, cucks. But this is only the case to someone who has never challenged their perception of what it means to be a man. The problem lies in the fact that we keep attaching our identities as men to toxic behaviors. These standards make us feel ashamed to be human, for doing things like crying or having most emotions that aren't rooted in hostility. The fear that most men face when the term toxic masculinity comes up is that if these behaviors that I've attached to my identity of being a man are not socially acceptable, then how do I perform in society as a man? I need aggression. I need to be cold and unapologetic in order to show that I'm the strong man that society needs me to be. I have to be a stoic rock who is trying to be the most alpha in the room at all times. Anything less, and I wouldn't be a real man if I even reached those standards to begin with. Which is the thing. These are behaviors that are most near and dear to the men who feel like they aren't reaching the standards of masculinity that society has set for them. The communities where the alpha, beta, real man mentalities are most often and aggressively preached as fact are not among the guys who society preaches as figures of masculinity. It's among message boards of nerds who probably can't do more than 10 push-ups if they can even do a push-up. And these are men who live by these ideas of manhood, but are physically and genetically not blessed to live up to these ideas naturally. But instead of questioning if the definition of masculinity that they have been raised to believe is actually accurate, they overcompensate with insecurity-fueled aggression and hostility, which is where it starts to become toxic. Even among men who go to the gym or have the physicality to be considered real men off of that alone, there can be a lot of toxicity around their sense of masculinity as well. Because as men, all of us, big, small, whatever, we are taught these things, and we have to take it upon ourselves to question how true or even how important these standards are and how we affect ourselves and those around us by going to such lengths to try to live up to these standards. So that leaves the question of if we do come together and say that all of these things that define the common perception of manhood are in fact toxic and we should let go of them, then what does it actually mean to be a man? All I can say is that a sense of security in yourself as a man comes from confronting that question for yourself. Some of the most respected symbols of masculinity who have had a positive impact on the world around them found that sense of security in their identities by letting go of the toxicity around their masculinity, and they started by first acknowledging that that toxicity exists. If that doesn't change your view, consider in the context of Avatar if you would say that Uncle Iroh isn't truly a man for the fact that he chose the path of love and acceptance over power and strength. But first, ask yourself which version of Zuko is better, the Zuko from Book 1 or the Zuko at the end of the story. Because Zuko had to face the toxic ideas he grew up believing about who he had to be in order to be an elite firebender, and let go of these toxic ideas in order to evolve into the anti-hero we learn to love. These are ideas we see him grow past throughout the story, even as early as Season 1. Zuko starts the story extremely temperamental, insecure, violent, refusing to ask for help. Pretty much any toxic trait associated with masculinity you can see in Zuko. Luckily, Zuko's Uncle Iroh was there to guide him away from those behaviors and set him down the path towards overcoming that toxicity. And this was really Zuko's entire journey in the story. But a big part of this development was in how Zuko's growth affected his relationship with firebending, and how it conflicted with his identity as a firebender. The initial motivation Zuko has in the beginning of the story is that he needs to capture the Avatar to restore his honor. Let's think on this for a moment. Because Zuko publicly showed weakness, he was banished from his nation and lost all respect. Because a teenage boy didn't want to physically fight his father, he is a disgrace and has to go on his rite of passage to prove that he isn't weak, or to prove that he is enough of a man, enough of a firebender, to hold the throne as a prince. This alone speaks to how these toxic ideas of what it means to be a firebender are so deeply rooted into the social culture of the Fire Nation. But once he joins Team Avatar to teach Aang how to firebend, he has to let go of all of that. The goal of capturing Aang and restoring honor was something he chased with passion and rage, which he used as fuel for his bending. But once he's no longer driven by that anger and aggression, his bending wasn't as strong. He was no longer trying to conquer the Avatar, he was trying to help the Avatar bring balance to the world and achieve peace, which was something that went against everything Zuko had been raised to know about firebending. For the entire series up to this point, firebending is framed as an art of destruction. Firebending is a weapon for war and violence. While we see waterbending used to heal, earthbending used to build, and airbending used as a way of peace, firebending is only shown to bring pain and suffering, which is why firebenders are the bad guys, because firebenders are just intrinsically destructive. Or that's what you're supposed to think. This was the way that firebending was portrayed because that was the social view of firebending within the universe. It's because of that culture that teaches their children that they learn to firebend so they may become soldiers. Firebenders are used to fight, to conquer, for war, to help their country spread through imperialism. Firebenders weren't raised to honor the traditions or have appreciation for the art form. They were raised to fight, to protect their nation. Firebending became an art of power. They even started hunting and killing dragons to prove the power of their bending. Dragons who are the first firebenders, literally killing the origin of the practice. And as a result of being raised in the society, Zuko's identity as a firebender was built on all of these ideas of conquest and aggression, forcing him to face this question of, if I abandon these behaviors that I've attached to my identity as a firebender, then how do I continue to be a firebender? Which is a similar dilemma with a lot of men in the topic of toxic masculinity. If I let go of these traits that I'm being told are toxic, then I'm giving up my identity as a man. But just like in the case of masculinity, this perception of firebending is a misconception. Zuko and Aang decide to go back to the roots of firebending and find the history that Sozin tried to erase. That way Zuko can really ask himself what it means to be a firebender, which the answer turned out to be that it's about creating and respecting life. Fire can be used as a force of destruction, but unlike the other elements, it is the only one that has a life of its own. So the art of firebending is to control, facilitate, and understand that life. And by extension, a true firebending master should be able to appreciate the life in all things. But in order to facilitate that life, there must be an inner fire burning within the bender to fuel the flame. The reason Zuko couldn't firebend the way he used to was not because he was no longer angry and toxic. He couldn't bend because he lost his sense of purpose. He had nothing driving him and fueling him, so he had no life to give to the flames. But once he made the conscious decision to push forward and give everything he could to teaching Aang firebending so that he could achieve his destiny as the Avatar and restore balance to the world, that was when Zuko was able to find that fuel for his fire once again, and even have the understanding to make Aang a great firebender as well. And now I have to cover my bases real quick. Even though I'm drawing a connection to real-life toxic masculinity, the unhealthy standards of firebending aren't only applied to men in this universe. This is a toxic ideology surrounding an entire form of bending. So this affects all firebenders who want to bend at an elite level. For example, it very clearly affects Azula. The difference between Zuko and Azula is while what it means to be a firebender is something that goes against who Zuko is deep down, it's natural for Azula. On top of being a naturally talented bender, Azula is a very cold human being. It's easy for Azula to be relentless, sadistic, unempathetic, competitive, ruthless. She's everything that her nation asks her to be as a firebender. She is a symbol of power. When Azula first appears, she is one of the most threatening characters in the show. She is talented, precise. Aside from her alignment, she's almost perfect. Part of this is because we only get to see her as an enemy, where she's fierce and intimidating, easily fulfilling her role. But once we start to see her as a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teenage girl, or even as a Fire Lord, we start to realize how toxic and self-destructive this type of identity actually is. Though Azula was the pride and joy of her father, she felt a lot of rejection from her mother because of her behavior. She was convinced her mother didn't even love her and thought she was a monster, which even though she took some pride in, must have been damaging and definitely shaped her sense of self. As for the rest of her family, her brother practically hates her and can hardly trust her even during a time when they were on good terms. And her uncle, who is usually very forgiving, accepting, and sees the good in people, thinks that she is crazy and needs to be taken down. To her friends Mei and Ty Lee, she was a toxic influence on their lives, making them feel like they had to walk on eggshells around her because of her short fuse. Not to mention, her manipulating and terrorizing them into being the people she wanted them to be until they eventually turned on her. Then the only time we see Azula interact with people her own age in a social setting, she really struggles to be accepted, because she's learned her entire life to be hostile and intimidating, which if that's you at the function, nobody wants to be around you. I will say that in the same episode, Zuko is definitely showing a lot of toxic traits of masculinity like we mentioned.
You blow up over every little thing. You're so impatient and hot-headed and angry.
But Azula was genuinely trying to perform in society as a teenage girl who wanted boys to like her, while she had absolutely no experience in that role. And in the end, she couldn't suppress the person she spent her life being enough to be accepted. She formed her entire sense of self around being this person, which is now a problem for her. And that might make you ask, what's wrong with that? If that's who she is, then who are you to say that's wrong? Well, the reason it's a problem is because she can't socialize or empathize with people, which maybe that's fine if your entire life is fighting people, but most aren't in that position. We have to talk to people every day, and being unable to do that in exchange for being an intimidating fighter is insane, especially if you're going to be a leader. As a leader, you need to have empathy to work with people, which once Azula became Fire Lord, she wasn't capable of doing. Her paranoia and thirst for power drove her to madness and left her unstable so Zuko could come and fairly easily overthrow her. I know she almost killed him and stuff, but like, come on. That was pretty easy as far as overthrowing world leaders go, because nobody was gonna protect her. And the reason that Zuko was able to do this was because he was able to let go of his unhealthy traits and evolve into the Fire Lord that would help the world move into an era of peace. Zuko could have never done any of this if he didn't find a healthy way to realize his identity as a firebender. But still, that leaves a question with an unclear answer. How do we practice masculinity without being toxic? We obviously can't go back to an ancient temple and ask a couple of dragons what it means to be a man. But we can ask ourselves what makes someone a man and why we think that. Look at the toxic things that we associate with being a man and ask yourself why we think that without them, we are somehow less than we would be with them. But more than anything, why is being a good man placed above being a good person? And does prioritizing being a good person make you less of a man? And for that, we can look to Uncle Iroh. Though he may be an old man who has had his glory days, the way Iroh approaches most situations is a great example of how to truly be a man. He knows when to step in and stand up for what he believes in, fighting for those who can't and being soft for those who need it. He knows when to give the people he loves the distance they need to figure things out on their own. He knew when to put people in their place and when to step aside and allow others to have their moment. He knew his strengths, he knew his weaknesses, and he knew what he had to offer to every situation. Wisdom, patience, restraint, all paired with a sense of responsibility to stand by his values. Overall, one thing is for sure, we were always happy to see Uncle Iroh. Even in Legend of Korra, we were happy to see him because we knew that he would be happy to help in any way that he could, because that's what he always did. It didn't matter if it was a stranger, a thief, or even a plant. Iroh always went into situations hoping to make them better. And Iroh also wasn't the type to run from his feelings. He was always a very expressive character who showed a wide range of emotions because he wasn't afraid to have those emotions. He was vulnerable enough to be sad or afraid, and secure enough to express love and happiness for the people he cared about. He loved even the little things in life, and that made him a happier person overall, which is something that we should all try to adopt in our lives. I'll be honest with all of you and myself, I might not be the person I want to be. I may not even be the person that I need to be. But the first step in becoming a better person is to recognize that you have these habits and then learn to move past them. I have a lot of life left to live, and I plan to spend every day getting better than I was the day before. The biggest problem with the backlash against talking about toxic masculinity is it's taking issues in how we as men tend to view ourselves. Things that may even be holding us back in life, and it pretends that they are either non-issues or that we just can't help it, that they're things that we can't live without. And by doing this, we are making the decision to avoid responsibility for our actions and our habits. We are letting our own destructive behavior go unchecked, and by extension, holding ourselves back from being the best version of ourselves that we can be. Just like the way that Zuko was holding himself back for so long. But once he confronted those aspects of who he was, it transformed him into a positive force for himself, the people he cares about, and the world around him. So if a man or anyone truly wants to discover what they can offer, they should first look inside themselves and ask how their actions really affect the world around them and why they do the things that they do. Do you do these things because it makes you happy and it helps the people around you? Or do you do these things because it's what you've been told you're supposed to do and that this is who you're supposed to be? If this is you, then I think that you need to ask yourselves the bigger questions. Who are you? And what do you want? Because at the end of the day, things like masculine and feminine are passive things that do not matter nearly as much as who you are as a person. My name is Tom, and thank you for joining me on the Runaway Club.